All right, welcome to this podcast. I'm very happy to be joined once again by Jason Horsley, who I think many viewers have already seen us chat a few times on his podcast, on his platform, on my platform, and I always get a lot out of this. So we were chatting. I've been recently, over the last year or so, more than uh, more than a little engaged with the exploration into what is behind the entire UFO phenomenon. My wife and I have been producing documentaries. We've been writing a lot of essays, trying to just wrap our minds around the nature of this thing, which has become more of a sacred story, a sacred lore in our modern age than simply just a fetish or an interest that people have had. Going to conventions, looking at government cover up conspiracies and reading books about it and pulp fiction books, which it typically was for most of the Cold War and even through most of my days growing up. That's most of what it was. But there was always this religious aspect to it that I didn't pay enough attention to, and now it's becoming more clear that that is what it's always been about. And Jason's done some very fascinating work and has contributed a lot of very powerful thoughts that I think are of high value. And specifically, his Prisoner to Infinity
Of
is a book
prisoner of.
of infinity. Thank you.
Hmm.
Is UFOs, Social Engineering, and the Psychology of Fragmentation is a book that was written. I think it was 2017. You wrote this.
Sounds about right. Although I did release the first part online on an online project in 2014, I think.
Really? Eh? Oh, that early in the. Okay, and this book is more than I anticipated. Going through a lot of the literature, I've been reading a lot of books, but this one ties in uh, paranormal. Ties in social engineering, MK Ultra operations, and a whole bunch of other aspects of the general oligarchical, manipulative social engineering uh, dynamics shaping or misshaping our lives. And you used the figure, I guess, maybe as a bit of a foil or an entry point of Whitley Streiber as sort
Yeah.
of the doorway that you opened up this story and started pulling together so many different threads that seem different on the surface, but actually tie together in one story. And I was surprised. So what put you on this path, man? Like, how did you find yourself as somebody trying to just piece things together on that particular road, telling that type of story? I don't know if that's too big of a question to open up with, but that's what I'm going to
No,
do.
no, not at all. I mean, as you're touching on there, I would say that the UFO as a subject, as damned, quote unquote, as it's been in a certain sense, in the Charles Fort sense of that term, like ostracized or marginalized, it does potentially intersect with just about everything. I mean, this is what I ended up with in Prisoner Infinity. Like I could get into just about every area of existence with this subject. Now, this wasn't why I chose it, however, but that's one bookend, and the other bookend is, as you say, the very specific entry point of Whitley Strieber, which is just one guy, right? And his experiences, although they're extremely extravagant, I mean, he has enough experiences for 20 ordinary people or 100 even, I think. Uh, and the reason, and Strieber is the reason that I wrote Prisoner Infinity because of my own preoccupation, infatuation, immersion in his Weltanschauung, his worldview. I mean, I took it on. Like, there's a number of writers. I would say this about Carlos Castaneda was earlier in my very early 20s. That changed the trajectory of my life. Of course, I touch on him in Prisoner of Infinity as well. Strieber came later, although not that much later, actually, my mid 20s. And the shoe fit as I explore in Prisoner of Infinity. I thought for the reasons I thought the shoe fit turned out to be very different. The reasons I thought the shoe fit was because I thought Strieber was writing about something real in an accurate way and an honest way, and that I was involved in some way, as in alien abduction, whatever that might be. But as I proceeded much later on, and this was more, it was about 15 years after I discovered Streiber that I started noticing the anomalies. And then the more anomalies I found, the more compelled I became to arrange those anomalies and see what sort of picture they would create like holes in a plot. Like if you get enough holes, you start lining up the holes and you can see what's behind the plot, so to speak.
Yeah. That definitely is the entry point for anybody with an active mind is you're looking for, like you said, the singularity, the paradoxes that don't fit. Where are the plot holes? And then you're like, well, either there's somebody being sloppy or there's another story that is not being told to me that I can figure out or triangulate into through these changing stories that are changing without being accounted for. And you do that quite well. Very well. And so maybe for those who don't know, maybe let's start with introducing the figure of Whitley a little bit. And I'm just going to pull out yeah, there's a quote that you have here from that I pulled out. When you were writing about your process about midway through your book, you just described in the process of taking a more nuanced and depth psychological look at Streiber's alien contact experiences. I have somehow wound up mapping the underground nexus of mind-controlled assassins, child sex rings, satanic cults, and celebrity murder. That's a little quote I just pulled from your thing, and it's true. Like you were pulling together. You were in doing this. You um I I was surprised to find such operations that I've been looking at from a totally different angle, playing a role directly in the story and the formation of Streiber's life. So I'm going to be asking you about who is Streiber for those who may not know. The fact that you have things like Process Church of Final Judgment, Scientology, the whole Charles Manson weirdness, also being woven into this thing, this strange story. The child sex rings in England and beyond, which also seem to play a strange role into the UFO abductee experiences. And as you've been mentioning, MK Ultra, psychological trauma and abuse that is systematically has been done for generations to young people. And it seemed like Streiber, I don't know what. So maybe the questions I would start here with would be: who is Streiber? What was the attraction you had to this figure? And what is it that's so important about his particular story and experience? Number two, also, do you find that he was himself, um, do you find that he was an authentic person who's been just mentally manipulated and screwed up by all sorts of trauma that he was put through? Or do you think he was part of the magic trick? Do you think he's aware that he's telling a very fluid story to keep uh, a powerful narrative about parapsychology and UFOs, uh, penetrating deeper into the zeitgeist? Do you think he's part of those higher influences, or is he himself kind of a victim, not fully aware of what the game is?
Well, that is always the question on my mind. I mean, not just with Strieber, but whenever I'm looking at a particular case. Uh, and as with so many things in the UFO field specifically, but generally in the kind of research that you and I do, including extending into the metaphysical, it might be an either or question, but then the answer it can't be fitted into an either or. It has to be more of a spectrum, particularly as the case with Strieber, somebody who seems to be showing through his writings symptoms of dissociative identity disorder, of being fragmented. So he himself doesn't appear to be conscious of some of the things all of the time, right? He seems to move in and out of different perspectives. So that's an important point that from the psychological perspective that makes the answer much more nuanced and complex. Another point, and this is an odd thing, don't think I even mentioned it in Prisoner of Infinity, but when I was still uh, unskeptically imbibing Strieber's works, a follower, if you will, I had a dream that it had to do with the Tavistock Institute, which I had not even heard of back then, really. I mean, maybe vaguely, but I remember the name in the dream. Obviously, it's, decades later, it became very central to mine and other people's researches. And the gist of the dream was that Streiber was a front man for a group, for an organization. So although there was one name on the books and other things were created by a think tank. And I didn't dismiss the dream because it had the flavor of something real, but I didn't take it literally either. I just left it there as a question mark. But now I would say that probably that dream was some sort of received insight. And I think it's a necessary lens for looking at Streiber and others like him to suspend that assumption or to question that assumption that just because there's one name that we're aware of and one personality that's representing this information, there's no reason to assume that that's accurate. So then for sure Streiber in that model, which I'm not saying for sure is a fact, but at least it's an example of the kind of the way that I do see Streiber, he would have to at least know that he's misrepresenting to that extent, that there are others involved that aren't naming themselves, that aren't identifying themselves. So that's quite a major thing in and of itself. As far as the actual accounts that he gives, his personal accounts, um, I do tend to think, I mean, the most important one is the event of December 85, I believe, or 86. I always confuse those years, when he first had memory of an encounter with the visitors, which later on or soon after that, he began to uncover these other memories that went all the way back to childhood, but specifically centered around this period in the 60s, which I focus on in the book, the late 60s. But that event, anyway, the main event that's the subject matter of Communion, the book that, kind of, well, made him famous, but also made the alien abduction narrative much more mainstream. I don't think he's making that stuff up. I think he's trying to be honest. So I would say that in the case of a specific example like that, a book and an experience, I lean more towards him being somebody who's been deceived, manipulated, traumatized, and handled in such a way that he is the perfect delivery device for this narrative.
What I've noticed in doing a lot a lot of research on the spiritualist movement of the 1840s until like 1920, which at various times became really big, um, especially when society is usually going through some sort of a crisis. Often these crises, whether war, economic crisis, collapse, or things that are mechanically being manipulated by higher geopolitical forces from above. But when things get bad, when there's a lot of scarcity, a lot of fear, there's a lot of tendency towards embracing leaps into dream narratives, superstitious narratives that would normally be rejected in times of calm waters. And so the spiritualist movement that involved a lot of channeling, a lot of, ghost rappings and things like that, levitation seminars, all sorts of things were going on and spreading all over Europe and North America, especially a lot of families that were traumatized with their children or husbands having died in the war, wanting to, speak to the ghosts. So a lot of people were making a lot of money doing that. And in reading how many of these were exposed as hoaxes, I got the sense that many of the hoaxers were themselves doing it because whether they were of the theosophical school or whether with of Blavatsky channeling the design, whatever this language of Shangri-La and from the great ascended masters, whether the hoaxes were from the theosophical school or from some other spiritualist Gnostic school, many of those practitioners were themselves devoted believers in the thing, even though they thought that they had to do certain tricks because people were too incapable of understanding the deeper spiritual reality. And so because they were naturally too simple-minded to understand higher truths of the higher spiritual realm, they had to do these tricks as a necessary evil. They weren't themselves liars about it. They were thinking that they were helping people with these tricks in many cases. So I feel that many of those promoting the new religion, and I do think of it increasingly as an attempt to create a new religion, involving the extraterrestrial narrative as doing a favor, like as people who are not necessarily, like you said, they're not necessarily lying in the simple-minded sense of the word lying. They're simply doing things that they think are needed to help open up our faith to the higher spirituality that they think that they're assisting us with, which is where it gets weird, I guess.
It does. Yeah, well, I mean, if you think of faith healing, uh, if if there's the belief or even the knowledge that in order for faith healing to work, the patient has to believe in it, well, you could justify that, right? I mean, you're healing them and it works. And with Streiber, one of the central pillars of his mythology is that the visitors are somehow ultra dimensional or not physical in the way that we are, and that because of this, um, what we perceive as the realm of the imagination is a means of access for these beings because they're not restricted to physical existence. They can also move through dreams and imagination and stuff. Therefore, which I think is superficially credible, or maybe even more than superficially credible, but therefore, to in order for us to have, and this is also in occult rituals and things, to have some sort of sustained contact with them, one of the ways we can facilitate or allow that is through belief. So um, that could also justify it. Like he's, well, I mean, even the CIA, let's say, if we go all the way to the dark side, MK Ultra, they're trying to um, bring about contact with some other realm, other dimensional reality, and they put on costumes and they use psychotropic drugs and stuff, and they enact these things with the belief that that will actually uh, pierce the veil between these worlds and allow something real to start coming through. And this is occultism 101. And I do think, I mean, it's funny you mentioned the spiritualism, that, as you probably know, is that also intersects with the Fabian Society. Frank Podmore was one of the founding Fabians. He was one of the early spiritualists. And you would not normally think of the Fabians as, and Annie Besant, of course, was a theosophist and also a Fabian, Alice Bailey. There's an absolute very large overlap there, but the Fabian is more obviously as a political, socio-political organization, right? So I do think that, not to go all the way to big picture, because so we want to focus on Streiber, but before we do, I do think that this thing that gets simplified as the Illuminati or whatever it is, some name for some secret organization throughout history, I think that's always a mistake. I don't think it ever helps make things clear, even though that's the point. I mean, that's the objective. It's trying to make something clear. But I think it's just a literalization of something that's so confounding that you want to just put a name on it and say it's an organization, that there's just this very consistent, coherent agenda unfolding, in which something like the Fabian Society and something like Theosophy intersects in the our time with UFOs, and it is all surprisingly coherent. So it's tempting to jump to the one organization, one agenda conspiracy theory, but it doesn't do justice to it at all. This is something far subtler and broader, but nonetheless, the general impression is the same. There's a consistent agenda that employs many different aspects of society and belief and so on. But anyway, so Streiber, what makes him so useful as a case study, even though I chose him for personal reasons because of my own involvement in his work, but it turned out he was the gift that kept giving, because the guy's been involved in everything. It's just incredible. And from the most mundane as well, right? And interesting, I mean, what part of his shtick, the thing that the way that, and Castaneda did this to some degree as well, but not to the same degree, I don't think. The way that he made communion, this narrative, palatable to the masses was by posing as an ordinary Joe. So it's like the Hitchcock trope. Extraordinary things happen to an ordinary person. We like that because we identify and we enjoy the process of excitement and fear and all that, where an ordinary person gets thrown into a world of extraordinary events. That's precisely how he frames his experiences. But in fact, as he himself reveals, although he never fully acknowledges this, he's always saying, I'm a conventional guy and this, that, and the other. A very ordinary guy. He's always insisting that. But in fact, no, you look at his history, which he reveals. Um, well, it goes back to childhood, but that's to do with MK Ultra and early experiences of whatever this phenomenon is. Um, so that's kind of compartmentalized away. But at a conscious level in the 60s, well, he went, just to briefly sum it up, because I never tire of doing it because there's just so much in it in such a short, just one paragraph really. He was working for I don't remember the name, but a major advertising agency in New York. I'm not sure the timeline here, but let's say we're talking about late 60s, early 70s, roughly this period. So that's the realm of Mad Men. Everybody's familiar with it now, with Mad Men. He was studying at the Gurdjieff Institute, which
German.
not many people are too familiar, but Gurdjieff was a major figure in the occult New Age circles, and I mean he was dead by then, but the institute certainly has lots of connections, and there's many leads to follow there. But the thing is, he was an advertising executive who was studying at the Gurdjieff Institute. That in itself is seemingly contradictory, really. It's unlikely. Um, he was in London during the in 1968, where he's supposedly studying and graduated at the London School of Economics, which is a Fabian institution, while also at London Film School. This is the same time supposedly he was at the University of Texas. Uh, I forget the city, but where Charles Whitman shot those people.
That's in Austin,
Austin,
Texas.
right? Which is where Streibers from, is Austin. So, and he was supposedly a witness to the Charles Whitman shooting. So this is in the same couple of years. Um, he was, because he was at the London Film School, he was making a film about the Process Church before anyone had heard of them. By his own admission, he was working for the London Foreign Office because they sent him on some. It's hard to keep track of all the details, but that had something to do with him making the film about the Process Church. And then later, uh, well, there's no real timeline for his involvement with the CIA, but he has said on more than one occasion, "Did I work for the CIA? I don't know. I know they tried to recruit me, but did I work for them? I just can't." He's having it both ways, but also acknowledging his fragmentation.
Mm.
And then this period was the period that he had this strange journey in Barcelona, where supposedly he was not abducted exactly, but he was drugged by this strange woman, and then he was made to have sex with her while these shadowy figures surrounded him. So some sort of cult activity, anyway. And he associates this with the visitors, the aliens, and then lastly, how he actually came to prominence was just after this period, or a few years after, when he started
This was
writing.
also this period. Sorry, this period too was also where he talks about being in the Vatican Catacombs or something.
Yeah, that's right. And which just sort of hangs there. It's just this thing, just one of these
Yeah,
stupid stories where he has this vague memory of seeing the devil's head in the Vatican
yeah.
Catacombs. Yeah, that was part of this period where he's got all these fragmented memories. Um, so yeah, Barcelona and then Rome, I guess, the same trip. But yeah, but he became known well before the communion as a writer of horror novels, so he's well known even to this day because of the films mostly. Wolfen, I think, was his first novel, and The Hunger, both of which were made. So Hollywood, they knew who he was very quickly, and he made it into the Hollywood inner circle as well during this period. So as I say, I mean, this guy's the Forrest Gump of conspiratainment of that world, and he just pops up everywhere.
Sorry, that a delayed reaction, but it hit hard. That's funny. Yes. Right.
Yeah,
Then he made a lot of like early on. They were already picking up his stuff and propelling him to fame. Right. He was being sold as the new Stephen King. And being marketed as such to the movies as well that people may not realize, like Day After Tomorrow, were
Yeah.
based on the works of Whitley. So yeah, he started in horror and kind of had all of a sudden his UFO abductee experience merge into his genre kind of very, very gracefully. He has this convergence.
Yeah, well, he would
Um,
disagree, however. I mean, part of his narrative is that he destroyed his career by writing Communion, even though that was made into a film with Christopher Walken. Not very good
yeah.
film, but nonetheless, a Hollywood film. But yeah, because he went from a horror fiction writer to a horror non-fiction writer and was insisting this is true. Fair enough, if he believes it is. And then he was demonized or ostracized for that and persecuted by South Park and things like that. I mean, he's very thin-skinned, which, to be fair, I mean, somebody who's so traumatized, you can understand, and somebody who believes, if he truly believes, that he was given this incredible experience in order to bring the truth of these whatever to the world. That's pretty much his position, which is a position that Jeffrey Kripal, this religious scholar from Rice University, has adopted. I mean, he has been advocating for Whitley Strieber in his own work precisely this context, that Streibers is the equivalent of Saint Paul or Moses, who's actually coming down off the mountain and bringing a new. He doesn't say a new religion because he's not explicit, but it is implied.
There's so many big things. Every time I hear you talk, I just want to stop you and ask you. But okay, so for again, Jeffrey Kripal is somebody who I only know this through your book, that he took such an interest in Strieber. Um, they co-wrote a book not that long ago called Supernatural, and he's been really marketing Strieber as, like you said, a Saint Paul, a prophet of a new age. Now Kripal is somebody who's also the official biographer of the Ellin Institute. It's no small thing to be given the license or whatever, given the sanctioning to be the official biographer of the Ellin Institute.
Yeah,
Puts you places you quite high up within a certain chain of command or a certain hierarchy of responsibilities.
I think so. Yeah,
That's his book here. For those who haven't looked at it, Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion, very useful book.
yeah, I
Also
should.
goes through, yeah, and it goes through the role of this thing that many people may not have even heard of so much or realized the importance of, but Esalen is something which was set up in 1962 following the thinking of Aldous Huxley on the human potential. And this thing was largely a hub that shaped so much of the counterculture movement of the 1960s, and that generated directly things like the Stanford Research Institute, the remote viewing, the work on parapsychology that would all utilize psychedelic drugs, all different forms. They were bringing in R.D. Laing and so many figures. Abraham Maslow was being brought in, and Charles Manson was a participant at some of these things. Um, so Kripal is playing a role in the story. Maybe you could say a bit more about Kripal, and number two, what's up? How are you thinking about the influence of these Satanists, or the Process Church of Final Judgment, as you pointed out, being something that Strieber was doing a documentary on, traveling with, that participated in his early fragmentation and memory loss. But I'm noticing this with Jacques Vallée, who supports Strieber, who's promoting Strieber like crazy, Hal Puthoff, like all of these figures around Robert Bigelow and the National Institute for Discovery Science, that are all like Vallée. I was reading his Passport to Mongolia, where he introduces the interdimensional ET hypothesis, and he describes how he's friends with Kenneth Anger. And he drops it in there in 1969. It was like, yeah, I'm just hanging out with my friend Kenneth Anger, and then you're seeing how he's friends with Anton LaVey, and there's a certain admiration for Satanism. John Alexander, the Colonel John Alexander, who's working with Michael Aquino, is also part of this thing promoting Strieber. Like all of these, they're setting up things in Skinwalker Ranch as their headquarters for their thing, their UFO disclosure thing funded by Lawrence Rockefeller, that you also talk about a little bit in the Lawrence Rockefeller operation in the back of your book. Why Satanism? Like how do you find the relationship of of Satanism and UFOs in your mind in the story so far?
Well, two things are coming to mind. The first thing is that uh, something like the Process Church, which also, like Streiber in a different way, just pops up everywhere. I mean, it's just almost like all roads pass by the Process Church, at least, and end up there. They always seem to be somewhere, sooner or later. So what is that? Because they seem like the official version is that this very marginal, very short-lived, splinter off of Scientology by these two people, and yet the ties are enormous, and to history, we could say, or to major players in history. Kenneth Anger also, I mean, what's his reputation based on? Ostensibly, it's that he hung out with the Rolling Stones, and he was very influential to other filmmakers like Lynch or Martin Scorsese that later did become huge. But actually, Kenneth Anger, who was a Thelemite Crowley follower and friends with Alfred Kinsey, it seems as though that's an example of a, let's keep it simple, like an intelligence operative or somebody who's fairly well positioned in the hierarchy, who's given some sort of role within the culture. That's his assignment. I mean, I'm not saying this as a fact. I'm just trying to keep it simple. And therefore, although they seem like this marginal character, they're really not. They're not. They're actually an influencer who's been assigned this task of influencing, and they're doing it, right? So I would say something like the Process Church seems to me it must be something like that, like it's a front. So now we've got things like ISIS and whatnot. They're these proxy armies for US foreign policy, etc., etc. That's fairly well known. Well, what about these proxies for intelligence agencies? Well, occult secret societies, which aren't secret, but they're secret in this sense because we don't know what they're really for or what they're really doing. I think there must be proxies often, and definitely in the case of Process Church, it must have been some sort of proxy. So then you can see that if they're doing a PSYOP, a long term, I mean, a decades-long psychological operation on Whitley Streiber in order to turn him into this prophet of a technocratic new age, then well, the Process Church was one of the teams that were assigned to his case, I think. I mean, I haven't spelled this out in the book, so I'm just doing it now just to kind of keep it simple. And interesting, I do mention in the book that William Simmons Bainbridge, who is a very little known character, but a very interesting and significant fellow who worked for the Pentagon and was an early transhumanist. He wrote about UFO cults in terms of being perfect, ideal hubs to create in order to do social engineering and observation and so on. But he also did a study of the Process Church. So, and the Process Church were also around in the 60s in London in Oz magazine, which is a famous underground magazine that was also tracking UFOs and all that stuff. They were also into the Process Church. They also interviewed Jimmy Savile, the infamous decades-long predator and pedophile. So what was I saying then? Bridge. Yeah, so Process Church is this cult that is a front for intelligence operations. And so Whitley Streiber, okay, we need to get Whitley Streiber within their grasp, so to speak. So we'll give him this assignment or lure him one way or another. It could have been Martin Sharp, who wrote for Oz, who Streiber was hanging out with in the 60s in London. I think pointed him towards Process Church possibly. But anyway, he ends up getting mixed up with Process Church, and that makes it easier for them to drug him and do these things, right? So that's specifically with Streiber. More generally, I think that there's no doubt that satanic ritual abuse and alien abductions overlap. There's no doubt that some of the time operations or acts of satanic ritual abuse are covered up by creating false memories of alien abduction. I mean, there isn't very much on this, but the one person I've spoken to about it, Alison Miller, who's a licensed psychotherapist who works with survivors of ritual abuse, said that she has spoken to a number of victims of ritual abuse who initially had memories of aliens and spaceships, and then with deeper probing, those things fell apart, and they ended up remembering something much more darker. So that's a kind of sort of surface level look way of looking at it. A deeper way of looking at it, which I think where somebody like Jeffrey Kripal, or Cripple as you call him, which probably suits him better, comes in, is what I call trauma genesis, and it's well, just different methods for the same purpose, really. Whether it's satanic ritual abuse, or whether it's some sort of staged or even somewhat genuine alien abduction, quote unquote. I mean, I don't know what the non-human element is there, but I think there is one. The end can be more or less the same. It's hacking into the psyche, psyche fracking.
Mm. Yeah, I was reading Carl Jung's Psychology of the Occult. I'm playing it around here. And in it, I was surprised to find out, or to yeah, this is one you might want to look at too. It falls into the story, the psychology uh, and the occult. And Carl Jung is almost admiring, much like, yeah, Cripple. I'm going to keep going with Cripple. Um, he's admiring almost the cases of schizophrenia and people who have been through, especially children. He's admiring that almost their fragmentation. He doesn't have the same type of psychological language that we're used to hearing today, but that's what he's describing. Um, because he's noting how these are people who are more in tune to channeling spirits, to being able to have clairvoyance, to tap into higher powers, and he doesn't treat it so much as a sickness as something fascinating to him that he adores almost. And you find that there's this, and then one shouldn't be surprised to discover that Carl Jung, much like Freud, are themselves practicing Kabbalah. Well, Freud is practicing Kabbalah. He's a major occultist. He's also working on and associating with a lot of pedophiles as well. And the whole realm of the science of mind in our society that's been so shaped by these individuals. You're like, well, this seems to be a scientific veneer imposed onto occultism, that's been sort of creating its own schools in the 20th century. Many people don't even know what the origins of the school that they're pursuing their degree or their PhD in. They don't even know. They're not an initiate. But it seems like Bull and Artie Lang and others who are associating with Ellin are very, very fascinated by the idea that creating cases of schizophrenia will heighten your sensitivity to the higher spiritual realms and give you powers of projecting, you know, onto the astral plane and accessing the Akashic records, or seeing what life was like on Mars a million years ago. Which, by the way, for those who are listening, thinking that this sounds like a crazy conversation, go to CNN right now, because it's looking more and more like National Enquirer, where they're talking about, how big revelations just happened this week of the CIA declassified reports of the 1984 remote viewers that projected themselves onto Mars's surface a million years ago, and proved that that big face on Mars was made by civilization. And they're acting like this is news,
Wow.
as if the CIA never lies to us. But that's actually happening this week as we speak, and it's, I think, referring to a lot of the content that the CIA was overseeing with the remote viewing project, the Stargate project. But again, they're always looking at this 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 idea that schizophrenia, breaking young people, especially early as possible, breaking them psychospiritually, will be the key into creating this new religion, or tapping into new prophets and new powers. Um, so what do you think of that? I mean, do you think that they think that what they're doing is evil, or are they self-aware of that? Or, I mean, Streiber seems to think that these aliens are loving, but it sounds like they're evil. What is your take? How do they think about the nature of these things that they're interfacing with, and what they're doing to young people, to children? Do they think that they're doing good, or are they doing do they know that they're doing harm, or what?
I think it's funny because I just wrote about this in my last Substack, just coincidentally, because I haven't gone near Strieber for ages. But the context was Nietzsche, and the will to power and the Übermensch, and or part of the context anyway. And so I think, and what I wrote was that the way that Strieber presents his visitors is as beyond good and evil. And so that's the kind of trump card at the end of all these accounts, as horrific as they are. He's saying A, that the end justifies the means, and B, therefore, that these beings and these methods are beyond good and evil. We can't judge them. And in one way, it's hard to argue with that because theoretically, well, I don't know. I mean, certainly we have a limited understanding of good and evil, and no one should try and claim that they know exactly the difference and the dividing line and so on and so forth, right? But that's more of a philosophical question. Um, with Strieber, the thing is that Strieber has to be the proof of his own pudding. He has to be showing as well as telling the philosophy that he's selling, and that's what he does. And so his stories are, and why Kripal is enamored of with them, if genuine, I presume it's genuine to this extent. It does involve a lack of a moral core, I think. But Kripal was enamored of, I mean, as I was as a kid, of superhero comic books. But then Kripal wrote a book about mutants and mystics and how the superhero comics, whereas I would now see them as part of the social engineering mindfuck, pardon my French, that actually primes us to believe this kind of bullshit. Not that they didn't have good qualities, but overall they're consistent, as is my love of David Bowie. They're consistent with a cultural engineering program. But yeah, for Kripal, they're blueprints for evolution, let's say, keep it simple, that this is happening, it's the evolution of consciousness and of the human being, and it's a good thing, and whatever it takes, including technology, needless to say, any kind of artifice, but even trauma, if trauma is the means to the end, well, then at least trauma gets somehow redeemed. A bad incidents in the childhood, we can transcend them by turning the lead into gold, psychically speaking, which is a Jungian kind of analogy with the alchemy. However, what I would say in response to this, and well, the whole of Prison Infinity is my response to it, and in a sense, my response to Kripal, because that was how it began, with me arguing with this contention that he has, that trauma can be a good thing. But my main exhibit is Whitley Streiber. And the thing about Whitley Streiber is, yes, he's got all these stories of incredible phenomenal events, and including superpowers. He's a guy who has superpowers one way or another, psychic abilities, and he can travel through time and space and blah blah, like the remote viewing stuff, which is something Scientology is all about, as well as promising you superpowers, but also technologically enhanced, like he's got an implant in his nose which he says dictates books to him and things like this. But the thing is that Strieber himself is a mess, and you don't have to pick through the minutiae of his accounts to see that he's a mess. um, in some ways really obvious, like he swings from loving to fearing and hating his tormentors, and saying, oh, they're evil, but then no, they're not, they're good, and oh, they help me, but I'll never get over that rape. Right? He's just constantly swinging back and forth in that regard. Um, but also, and the many anomalies that we started with, but also just his manner, his way of being, his way of speaking. That was the thing that tipped me off to begin with. Admittedly, this is very subjective, but um, when I heard Strieber's voice, I was shocked because he sounded slightly deranged, and he sounded very crass, like an American coast to coast kind of pundit who's selling snake oil. That's how he sounds. But I thought he was this very wise, grounded individual based on the way he wrote, and he's clearly not. He's all over the place. So, but I don't think. I mean, clearly he doesn't know it, and Kripal doesn't know it, or doesn't care if he does. So I think that this part of the answer to your question is, if you practice some kind of Nietzschean, theosophical, whatever, occultist, Crowleyanic will to power, which involves expanding your consciousness by whatever means necessary. And if you associate just more and more epic and strange and occultic experiences with expanded consciousness, which is an error in and of itself, I would say, um, then you end up becoming more and more delusional, to keep it simple, more and more unhinged, and by definition, you don't know it. And it's not either or either. You are accessing visions and you are accessing knowledge and power, but you're becoming more and more unhinged, right? And you don't know it. So to
Yeah.
you, it's good, but to somebody, to your victims, but also your relatives or anyone who's paying attention closely and can bear to look, it's not good. But then to them, you just can't see beyond good and evil, right? You're not
Mm.
initiated, so you're not aware that it is good, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And on that issue too of Paul's fascination too with the X-Men, the it caught my eye too that he puts so much of a creepy degree of excitement around the conjunction of the creation of the X-Men in 1962, and he's like, oh, it's this same month that Esalen Institute was also created. And
Uh,
yeah, it's like a school for gifted children or these more than humans overseen by Charles Francis Xavier, right? One of the handlers of Ignatius Loyola as a little tip of the hat there for those in the know. And God knows what the Jesuit conditioning process is in the inner echelons. I can take guesses based on certain outward information, but you've got this. But also that ties into H.G. Wells because I was surprised as well to find out that the whole idea of mutants um, comes in many ways, as so many things do, from this Fabian Society grand strategist H.G. Wells. You mentioned the Fabian Society earlier. I don't think he was so much of a supernatural mystic, but he was a high level game master on the game board. He actually invented board games. He's the
uh,
inventor of modern board games. Um, and he wrote a book called Food of the Gods in 1904, describing this this uh, this laboratory created food that could be given to humans and to animals that would create these new mutants that would create a new evolutionary phase in existence. And then he built on that. And in 1927 or something, he wrote Starbegotten, describing how these alien beings are infusing cosmic rays onto the Earth to generate mutations in humanity to create these new superhumans.
yeah,
Which
like Fantastic Four, cosmic rays.
Fantastic Four. That's exactly it. 100%. Uh, so yeah, this whole Nietzschean idea that we take. I mean, I love comic books. I still like comic books, but it's like you can't take any of this stuff for granted as if it just organically emerged as a genre, without realizing that there are these more subtle forces that have been nudging our imagination and painting our imagination into a certain place that would allow for, um, I guess, a narrative about what is reality, what is our nature, what is the universe that normally we would never expect. If we had our full faculties intact, we'd be like, no, no, thank you. But
Mm.
but because of this multi-generational creative nudging, we're open to things that you can only sort of act upon things that you can first imagine as plausible.
Well,
So
that's a
yeah,
big part of it. I mean, it's a big part of Prisoner of Infinity as well. The scenario planning of NASA is they want to seed, whatever this is, wants to seed generations of humans with the ideas, the imagination that will then allow them to bring it out, to realize it in some way. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the trauma is very central to this for two reasons that perhaps are both obvious, really. One is this main subject of Prisoner of Infinity, and I think what we're talking about now, the main data point is dissociation. Like trauma leads to dissociation, and in a dissociated state, you can access other realms, not higher realms. I almost said higher, but that would have been a mistake. Other realms, right? Non-physical realms, because you're separating from the body. And so you can feel like you're accessing powers in a certain sense. At a worldly level, you would be. You could remote view or whatever, things of this kind. So that's number one. The overlap or the conflation of dissociation and retreat into fantasy with psychism. And number two is, if you're traumatized, you're going to be more driven. You're just generally more driven, unless you're crippled. I mean, it has to be the right degree of trauma. That part of the dissociation, you have these fantasies. I mean, someone like Elon Musk could be a contemporary topical example, I think. I haven't studied him, but like, it doesn't have to be psychism and superpowers. It can actually just be great ideas and genius in the tech world or something like that. But yeah, so you've been trained in this way to escape the trauma, the adverse conditions through dissociation and fantasy. And then, of course, you want to make the fantasies real so that you can actually create a world that represents them and escape into that world, the metaverse. So then you're very driven to achieve these things, to realize these fantasies. That's like just a formula for social engineering, I think. And it brings all of these different agendas together.
Well, and you made that point well when you were talking in your book or writing in your book about the idea that these people who are on this pathway, they tend to have an idea of heaven as something that must be violently stormed, not earned through the grace and faith and charity, but rather just stormed through the imposition of will to overpower whatever. And as you also made the point, if you actually take that philosophical view, you're actually more than likely breaking yourself further and further away from whatever this idea of heaven actually is. You're probably becoming more further removed if it's not associated with some development of your I guess I'm adding my own words here to it now, but the way I was seeing it is your own sense of grace and love and faith in things we'd associate with goodness.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, physicality, I mean, I would say you could reduce it to something very simple, as they do in the book, is the body, being connected to the body. And then this also brings us back to this question of good and evil, because if the body is, if the morality is a bodily sense, which I think it is, because I don't know where else it's going to come um, from, then yeah, the more you dissociate from the body, the less you want to go back to it, is number one, because you're trying to escape the trauma that's in the body, and you found a method, but then it's not resolving itself. So you just want to have to keep dissociating further and further from the body, and you find you're getting more and more prodigious powers by doing it if it's working. So you've got less and less incentive to get back to the body, but also your moral sense is gone. You've got no compass if you're not anchored in the physical. I mean, this is the Christian idea of the body being the image of God, I think, is pertinent here. It's like our reference point for what is good, I think.
yeah, no, there's something to that, eh? Definitely the idea, because there's this dichotomy, right, where many of these people, they do in their heart, whatever that is at this point, believe that they're doing something virtuous. Aleister Crowley called his set of lodges the Agape Lodge, or the Agape Lodges, for a reason. There's some weird idea of what agape meant and what they're willing to do for another to help initiate them into the higher truths, which might involve, as you've pointed out, the type of uh, disgusting, and in our view, disgusting experiences that Streiber did go through, and that so many initiates go through, and some people who don't have the stomach to, when they meet the guardian at the threshold, after God knows whatever initiation practices they've been through, all of a sudden you have to meet, your shadow dark self in some way that seems to be like there seems to be uh, an invariant in that ritual that if you cannot battle and internalize that darkness, then you become weak. You're almost expendable. But if you have the strength to internalize that darkness and come out of it, as Crowley says he did, and Edward Bulwer Lytton says he did, and others, then you've like attained your perfection. At that point, you're like beyond good and evil, and now you're whatever you say is God. I think that's as good as. So it's really if you could do that for somebody else, wow, what a benevolent thing. what a benevolent thing to that Maria Abramovich is probably helping Jay-Z do, or Roman Polanski is being given such great training by, followers of Crowley or whatever. Like there's this strange sense of like morality and immorality fusing together to create this thing that's totally, as you said, detached from our physical existence, our body. Like it's just it's totally disassociative. So do you think that they're creating like, is it dissociative identity, or are they creating other personalities, fragmented personalities, like you have alters what do you think about what is this? Is this still them, or is this totally now something else that's being created?
Well, I would imagine that it's not the same in every case. In fact, every case might be quite unique in this regard. If you think of the psyche, I mean, first of all, we don't quite know what the psyche is, or maybe we don't at all. It's not like the body where you can describe it and study it. I mean, psychology is the study of the psyche, but I think we both agree that that went weird very quick. I mean, it started out weird even with Freud and Jung. They were both untrustworthy witnesses, I think, or narrators. So, and that's partly why they could be. I mean, because the psyche, not that you can't lie about the body as we're seeing, but still, what was my point anyway? Oh yeah, so a fragmented psyche is going to fragment. I mean, so if you just think of an egg, you drop it, it shatters. There's going to be a different pattern every time you do that. There's an infinity of possibilities for how a psyche could fragment, possibly. Um, so, so that's number one. Like clearly, what we're talking about here. Uh, there is this rationale, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, combined with, well, not every egg we break is going to make it into the omelette, or it's going to make an omelette, because if the eggshells get too mixed up in there, we just have to throw it out. Clearly, there has to be an awareness with, even if you don't go all the way to MK Ultra, that for every one Ubermensch or pseudo Ubermensch that is created, or Streiber, let's say, or Huxley or Musk or whoever we think might have been Wells. We don't know necessarily their backstory, but Streiber we do. There's going to be 999 who just end up derelicts on Skid Row, I suppose. I mean, there's a class thing going on as well, but so I mean, the working class, the lower classes probably aren't generally seen as potential Ubermensches, suppose. But even within the upper classes, there's definitely a lot of casualties, my brother being one. Although he came fairly close to the mention thing. So that's my first response about the psychic fragmentation. The other is, I mean, so to finish that, yeah, the successful experiment would be somebody who had somehow managed to rearrange the fragments in such a way that they gave dominance to the fragment that was working for the hierarchy, let's say, that was most fully aligned with these agendas and philosophies. So that conscious part that says this is justified, this is the end, these are the means, there's whatever the cost, we will achieve it. That gets to be in the controlling position, and the other fragments are lined up with it. That's when it's working, quote unquote. Now, and there may be that these characters are quite consistent, because I think we've touched on this, and you must have had that thought, as I've had that thought sometimes, like, are they actually part of the same club, or are they just being run by the same beliefs and agendas, right? It's kind of either or, it can be both. So I think this speaks to that there might be a presiding kind of psychic driver that if you manage to get it installed, then you're more than in the running, you're in on the team, and so that's a successfully psychically trauma generated player in the game. The last thing I want to say, the other thing was that, but we don't have to go, well, it's fitting for Prison Infinity because it's about entities, is how much is this about entities? How much is this about actually letting something non-human take over the psyche and therefore the body? That's unknown, but I think it's probably a major factor. There might even be that might even be the answer, is a voluntary, systematic form of possession.
Yeah, well, it seems like that's sort of what they desire in some way, and whether or not it's always difficult with these games within games. You're like, well, which is running what at what points? Are there free agents making their own internally directed, driven decision making, and at what points are these also just sort of higher level automata
Yeah.
sort of operating on a blueprint from a higher force? Ultimately, I don't think that there are. I don't know you about your views, but I don't think that there's like rational, self-driven actors anywhere up the chain of command in this thing.
Mm.
What my the way I'm philosophically thinking about the nature of this oligarchical principle, and it's not like, as you said, you will try to like oversimplify it to the Illuminati or this one agency or another, and you can't do that. There are these invariants. You can't like say it's this one thing. But I do think of it as like one of the attributes is there's this self-delusional suicide impulse, like this desire to not be,
Mm.
that's fundamental in the drive. Where you look at some of like almost all the sacred stories that I look at from like ancient pre-Christian times, as well as like the Gnostic origin stories that you can get from the Nag Hammadi scriptures. They all involve like Yaldabaoth and some like creation from nothingness that created these aeons that have sex with each other that produce ultimately an abomination that hates men and that wants to have sex with herself and creates a mutant like a Sophia who just is so deranged she has sex with herself, produces a Yaldabaoth, which then just is animated purely by ignorance and hate and self pride and just produces basically everything you see in the Old Testament. And they're like that Yaldabaoth that created the world in 7 days is ultimately the evil God, and that the good God and good Jesus, as they define it, is like the Sethian Gospels. It's the Lucifer character, and Jesus actually had a secret doctrine, which is what Lucifer was teaching to his favorite initiates. And they have this whole thing, but ultimately in their cosmology, it's this grand nothingness that they all aspire to like tap back into as a source that's beyond right and wrong and good and evil. And to do that requires these various rituals of merging the sacred and the profane. We have to figure out different ways of merging sacred murder, sacred orgies, other things, and the more you can merge opposites, especially moral opposites, together into the common actions, the more you equip yourself into becoming your pure natural thing, which is nothing. And you see how they try to impose this through CERN and other things on redefining what the universe is around Big Bang and the heat death and the idea that we're all like sort of everything was created 13 million years ago, billion years ago, and it's all sort of expanding into nothingness. And soon we're going to go back to the natural nothingness out of which we came. And there's this obsession with imposing nothing as primary into the something, like the not being is dominant over the being, that I think that they kind of want to die. At the end of the day, I think that the oligarchy is animated by a religion of kind of wanting of self-hate and wanting to not be, which that's how I think about them. I don't know if there's
Yeah.
actually evil forces beyond that as a positive evil pushing them and propelling them. I don't know that. Maybe, but yeah.
Um, yeah, well, I certainly in Prison Infinity, I don't get to that speculation. Big Mother, I get a bit closer to speculating about discarnate evil, but with Prison Infinity, I take more of a psychological model, as you know, or lens, and I think what you're describing there, to some degree anyway, is a trauma-generated program. Like if we have been installed with, or if our body has been traumatized to the extent that that unprocessed pain and horror and fear and rage and all whatever else the trauma consists of is driving us at an unconscious level, then it stands to reason that that might well be a suicidal drive one way or another, because it's a drive to escape physicality, and the ultimate escape of physicality is death, of course. So I think, yeah, I think that's a factor for sure, or maybe the factor. The other thing that is very relevant to Prison Infinity and what you just said is the drive to get back to the womb, which I superimpose or I map the drive for space colonization onto that, because space colonization, traveling to other planets, before any of that could happen or even be imagined, the thing that has to happen is escaping from the earth, so to speak. I mean, escaping, I'm putting it in the language of trauma there, but you have to leave the earth behind. You have to disconnect from the earth. Um, and then off into space, right? So that's also like consistent with a dissociative drive to become disembodied. And yeah, so the desire to return to the womb, uh, I think is also consistent with, or another way of looking at the desire to merge with nothingness. Because when we're in the womb, we physically exist, but we don't psychologically exist. We don't have a self or an identity. So I don't think it's either or. I think there's two things going on there. There is a desire to merge, to re-merge back into the mother's body, which you could say is the universal matter, or, like if you want to get archetypal about it. Um, but that itself is a self-destructive thing because we can't go back. We can't go backwards.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, 2001: Space Odyssey is sort of exhibit A for this. There's a
Yeah,
lot. There's a lot
exactly what
of
I was thinking there. Yeah.
was it? Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
But I mean, it's so far extending these myths. They're so well extended into society that um, yeah. I mean, I think this whole thing of boundary dissolving is very central to things we're seeing throughout in society. The boundaries are bad. I mean, borders, literally, for example, are considered bad. They're oppressive. They're patriarchal. Patriarchy itself is bad because patriarchy imposes boundaries, and so on. So there's a fairly basic dichotomy there between the need for boundary structures, limitations, and the drive to transcend all that. And clearly, both can be oppressive. Uh, so clearly, some sort of balance is required. But what we're talking about currently, it does seem to be a drive to transcend all boundaries, for boundaries not to exist. But if boundaries don't exist, then you don't exist, right? We can only exist within certain boundaries.
yeah. Well, it seems like this is where you have the disingenuity. I don't know what the word is. Of this philosophical school because while they have this idea, and you talked about it in your book of the taboo and the socially usefulness, like they recognize that there's something socially useful about creating a coherence in social dynamics of taboos. You know, basic basic boundary conditions, which I think from a healthy perspective would be like conscience tempers our passions. And so these this particular philosophical school recognizes that taboos are just simply social conventions that have a useful practicality to them to keeping people bounded and controllable, but at the same time, it prevents us from tapping into the unboundedness of what we believe our true transcendental self should be. But they also know that like they're elitist. They're Nietzschean elitists. So they also know that the majority cannot tap into that transcendence that they want to reserve for just the few who will be, powerful enough or strong enough to transcend those things. But they see the taboo as like something you could try to break. You could go out of your way. And that reminded me of the story or the anecdote you have of Jimmy Savile, who apparently according to an associate of his, described one of the most or the most powerful, meaningful 5 days of his life when he spent with the dead body of his mother who just died. And it's like I don't know what you did in those 5 days with your mother. Uh, of course, looking back at the peculiarities of his proclivities, the mind is unfortunately forced to imagine certain things.
Yeah.
Um, but it seems like these guys are engaged in, as you Jack Parsons as well. Seemed as though he was engaged in sexual acts in his Ordo Templi Orientis lodge with his mother. It seems like there's something being explored there, that touches on some weird idea of returning to the womb of this Virgin Mary, but also having this idea that Mary also is the whore, sacred whore that one should also lust after. And you have this weird convergence in a lot of these circles of the dual nature of the figure of the Mary identity into the Madonna and the whore as one, right? And they translate this onto their mother, the perfect mother who loves me. That ultimately, I eat this weird stuff and this edible complex stuff that kind of just permeates the terrain. And I don't know how to think about it fully, but there's these. It's hard to talk because it's so hard, like so unnatural in some ways to just approach the way we're trying to get into the mind of these creatures. But it is a big part of the formula, it seems. I don't know if there's anything you on that weirdness you want to chime in on. That's,
Well, I think the theme, well, one of the themes we're on is transgression and the use of transgression to transcend our limitations. And so having sex with a mother is, well, it's not just archetypal. According to Freud, it's primordial. I'm not sure I believe that, however, but if people do believe it, and Freud worked tirelessly to make people believe it, that can almost work as well. Um, yeah, no, oh, and then another thing, I thought we'd bring it back to Strieber because we pulled quite far out, was that Strieber, not many people who do know Strieber and his work know or remember that the famous figure on the front of Communion, this famous face of the alien that pretty much took over our culture, that was turned into a grey alien, was a female. And that's there's one visitor throughout Streber's accounts that recurs. Like, there are many beings that he claims to encounter, but there's only one, I think, that he refers to repeatedly as the same being, and it's this female being that he's made to have sex with. He believes had a child with, although I don't think he ever claimed to have seen that child, and that he is the love of his life, the greatest master he's ever known. He says, as in the greatest spiritual, being, and the love of his life, even though he was married physically. So yeah, big mother, like an archetypal mother. He compares her to I forget which, but one of the mythical, the goddesses, mythical goddesses, not Isis, another one, Artemis maybe. Anyway, it is very central to Strieber's story, um,
hmm.
and well, what I ended up doing with Prisoner Infinity, and what I'm trying to do now in our conversation is, I think part of the trap of this stuff is that we do get lured into trying to think about things that can't really be thought about, trying to understand things that can't be understood, as if somehow that is our destiny or our opportunity as human beings is somehow to grasp the infinite. Uh, and I just don't think that's accurate. And so anyway, uh, I wanted to psychoanalyze Whitley Strieber and myself because I fell under the spell of that and reduce it, be a reductionist, and show that at least a large percentage, possibly 90% of the myths that Strieber is co-creating can be reduced. Admittedly, I'm falling back on another myth, which is Freudianity, but whatever, if I can use it as a tool, I will. And I'm not closing the book, but just to demonstrate how much of this stuff can be reduced to childhood trauma and to transference and projection, and the attempt to escape into these grand narratives of occult empowerment, that makes it all rather sad, really, and rather laughable. And I think it really is necessary because, I mean, my trajectory has been to gradually retreat from this chapel perilous of Übermenschen aspiration and get try and get back to the body and ordinary physical mundane existence, as if that has become, the holy grail, really, for me to get back to that. And because that in itself, it doesn't have an allure, like it's considered dull and uninteresting and uninspiring and beneath us. We're supposed to be aspiring to the stars, figuratively or literally. Um, it's hard to get motivated. And so part of how I've motivated myself was by debunking these myths, like seeing, well, actually, this is childhood trauma. There's nothing to be proud of. There's nothing to be pleased about. And you don't want to, turn these values and these stories into your defining things because they're coping mechanisms, basically what they are.
Do you find in your life the greater pleasure and meaning to be found in the particulars of the day-to-day existence or in the pursuit of making sense and making discoveries of things you didn't know about? Uh, Obviously, you're doing both at the same time. But which one do you find has greater leads in the joy and purpose, or do you find that yeah?
I would say that, seeing as you put it that way, that the merging of the two is where the greatest satisfaction is. So, for example, if I'm, as I am, I'm keeping goats and I'm trying to figure out how to stop them escaping, which involves learning more about building fences, which learns more, learning more about how to bend wire and just really basic stuff, right? That I am discovering more about stuff. It's not rocket science, but that's kind of the point. I would never be a rocket scientist, and I never want to be. And I don't. You have to be initiated, to get at that level. But this is something anybody can learn if they just have the will. So that's at the most basic level. Um, but it also has this deep metaphorical meaning, if you like. If I want to go there, I can see that, the goat represents my primal instinctive self. It needs containing. I'm having to, right? It is a psychotherapeutic process, but I don't have to analyze it to benefit from it. But then less profanely or mundanely, for example, the men's online meetings that I host weekly, and something similar where I have the opportunity to interact with people, unfortunately online, and explore and investigate some of these things. I mean, Whitley Streiber came up at a recent meeting. We don't usually talk about other stuff that's out there so much as our own lives, but sometimes we do. Sometimes it is like a think tank exploring the mystery of the world, and it's often very theological. I mean, there's definitely a religious or metaphysical or spiritual approach to the meetings that I host. But the main thing is this human dynamics, human interaction, which is also mundane. It's also not mundane because human beings, are very profound. But that that to me is where the real pay streak is the bringing those two together. We can still be searching for greater insights, of course, but doing it in a way that's much more um, in the trenches, hands in the dirt, human social interaction, or maybe it's not social exactly, but it's definitely human.
Mhm.
Something like social. I mean, it's what social could be if social interaction wasn't just a bunch of sort of Masonic codes and handshakes that we've been trained to do. You know what I mean? Which is mostly bullshit.
Good
So
old fashioned human to human engagement. Yeah.
we're
Mm.
trying to learn to be honest. I mean, you could reduce it to something very simple. How can we be honest, honest and authentically interact with one another without any of the social bullshit that we've inherited? Some of which we've been talking about today, the values. We've been given this false set of values. Um, and I don't think we can discover what a really meaningful value set is except by interacting with each other and finding out um, what is meaningful outside of it. It is definitely a non-mental orientation. So I guess that's also to answer your question, or part of what was in your question is, I think discovery and deepening one's knowledge should be more of a physical thing than a mental thing. So all those books behind you and all these books behind me, it's very entertaining. I'm not saying we shouldn't read, but I do see it as mostly entertainment.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess it's always this idea, like everyone's struggling with the change, no change, being, not being. These opposites that seem to exist in the universe, and trying to find a way to think about how to have them dance together in the most lawful, uh, organic way possible, and to not become. I have a friend of mine who gave me the statement. He's like, some a lot of people, they're so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good, but there's certain people who are so earthly minded that they're no heavenly good. So you want to be able to find a way to have both dance together, the metaphysics and the physics. The
Absolutely. Yeah, well, that's what
Yeah,
we're here for, I would say.
yeah, and
And
we
that,
know the oligarchy thinks about these things a lot. That's part of one of the themes of the last several thousand years of human existence, is this top down wrestling with these coexistent opposites. They've come up with their own way that they dance together, and we see the effects. We can measure the effects of their particular formulation of how they coexist, and look at the effects of it as far as uh, the emergence of chaos, divide to conquer, forever wars, wars of civilizations, people who don't know themselves by design, people who are, you know, conditioned to bring out the worst version of themselves as possible so that they're going to be more easy to control, against their own interest. And that's been done in every civilization, every cultural matrix. We know we can deduce what a bad hypothesis about how these two states of being and not being, or change and no change, will be brought together. So I guess the best we could do is try to find what's a better hypothesis than the one that Edward Bulwer Lytton, uh, is devoting himself to, or Aleister Crowley is devoting himself to, and seeing something, or Paul.
well, I think it can, it certainly, it says about my father in the past that if you can't have a positive example for your father, uh, a negative example can also be useful. Because, well, and my brother also, I mean, he showed me many of the wrong ways to go about things. Not that I haven't made plenty of my own mistakes. I see myself as an example for other people, a negative example, but well, both, because I think I'm somebody who's learned from my mistakes. Therefore, I can offer both. I can share my mistakes, but then I can say what I've learned from them. And so this is about, I mean, this is a very deep sort of complementarity, like yin and yang, whereby something negative can have a positive influence. And so I think you have thought about, I think we've talked about perhaps, but have you considered that the oligarchic hierarchies, according to Alice Bailey, they're going to be fully externalized this year, but anyway, it's just a rumor. Um, that go, back millennia and are probably metaphysical at their deepest level, that they might A, be perennial, they're never really going to change, they just keep evolving and eroding and whatever, degenerating. But B, they might serve a function for the good, but they might actually serve a function for those of us who are able to navigate our way through that. I mean, my experience of school, for example, was I hated every minute of it, and I didn't believe a word of what anyone was trying to tell me to believe. And I felt like a complete fish out of water. But because I had to go, just as we have to be in the world, I had to develop strategies and approaches and means by which to move through that system and be as oppressed, little oppressed as possible. And so by the end of it, but certainly a couple of years after, I ended up thinking, well, it was a very useful experience. Admittedly, it was useful because the world that I was then, moving into as an adult was just a larger version of that.
Yeah.
That's true. I mean, that's just a fact. So I can still say, well, maybe the world itself is a way to train us. I mean, this is kind of Book of Job stuff in a way. I would say it has to do with letting go, and letting God is the cliche, but at a practical level, it has to do with a kind of fluidity and flexibility, whereby we can actually move through the world of matter. It's a bit Gnostic now, but and this system in a way that we don't compromise our spirit, and we don't submit, we don't become oppressed or damaged or injured. and of course, find our way through and whatever's on the other side. But on the way through, we find those that we need to find and connect to them, and we become part of something that is moving through the world to what's not of this world. And we're getting very fancy now, but there has to be some. Obviously, if the world has its function that is helping us to see and understand and navigate something, there has to be something beyond the world by definition. I mean, anyway, you're a
Mm,
nihilist otherwise if you don't believe that. So that's the game changer for me. I mean, for this came up in a conversation in my last podcast. Actually, faith has to do with not worrying about worldly stuff. That's the evidence of faith. It doesn't matter what you believe. It's just, do you have a felt sense that something is moving us towards the good and where we need to get to, that we're on our way home and we have a guiding system that will take us home. That's faith. So then you can look at the battlefield you're moving
mm,
across and, well, I hope I don't get hit, but I'm not going to, I'm not going to try and win the war myself, and I'm not going to say war is evil. I'm just going to get to the other side.
yeah. Well, it's definitely a profoundly personal thing. A few things that entered my mind or that awoke in my mind as you were speaking. And number one, I was thinking about St. Augustine's demonstration. A lot of people were philosophizing, are human beings fundamentally evil by nature or good? And he made the point in a simple way, but I enjoyed it, that in its simplicity, that if we all agree that human beings can all be corrupted, um, then doesn't that mean we're fundamentally good? Because to be corrupted means that you must have been good to begin with in order for that corruption to have taken you away from your natural state. Hence the word corruption, which is, again, it's perhaps overly simplistic, but I liked it. I think it made sense. But then what do you, because you're touching on the value of being born into a world where corruption at different times, I guess it's more and less pervasive, depending on what period in time or part of the world we're born into. And I don't know if it's always going to be the exact same degree of corruption. I don't think so. Um, but then there's a usefulness in that you can better appreciate the good. You can better, by seeing where it's not, as you pointed out, whether in the microcosm in an abusive family dynamic or in a broader society. But it doesn't always work because a lot of people don't take that lesson. They become more nihilistic. They become more broken as well. So there's something else that certain people have who took the higher lesson and became better for the bad experience that they went through, and they took a lesson that helped them. And the other people, many other people who lacked a certain something, and I'm not trying to sound like it's an elitist thing, but there's something there that resulted in a different, them being broken, them taking on a missing the chance to learn the lesson. Um,
Yeah.
what would that be? That's there in
Well,
those who do make the positively from
I
the
mean,
bad.
I have direct experience with somebody like this as my brother, so I can
Mm,
definitely relate, that it can happen to individuals, and that is tragic, and that's our business as well. Like, we're not just here to look out for ourselves. However, we're definitely not here to look after 8 billion apparent, alleged souls, but even alleged bodies. We don't even know there's 8 billion people. We're just told that. But I mean, this humanity, this so-called humanity, clearly isn't our business. Like, it can't be, even though we're propagandized by globalists to think that it is. Um, and I relate this to, well, a hypothesis, let's say, that the system isn't corrupt because the system was designed to be the way it is and it's serving its function. So it's not corrupt, it is corrupting. That is the function, part of the function of the system. Somebody said on this podcast that the system exists so that people can skew their responsibility. They can just not take responsibility for their actions. And that is corrupting. If you don't take responsibility for actions, you will end up corrupted, of course, because you're not, the consequences, you won't be answering to them, and so you'll just keep getting away with shit. So if you consider that the system just is what it is for whatever reason, right? We could get into psychology and metaphysics, Girardian mechanics, but anyway, then and what it is not corrupt but corrupting. because it's designed in this way that actually is disconnected from higher reality. It's like a sort of quarantine realm or something like that. Then the question is like, well, how am I going to respond to it? You know, am I going to be corrupted? That's obviously question number one. And then question number two, those that I care about, can I help them? Um, or can they help me? That seems to be where it ends, really, for me, because all that, I mean, this is in the Matrix, right? That if you're not, what is it? They'll fight to protect the system. Until you've been unplugged, people will fight to protect the system, right? And we can see this. We saw this in the age of COVID, right? Those years, we saw it very starkly. So, to the extent that, let's just say a lot, let's not assume that we know the proportions of this, but an awful lot of people out there are aligned with the system. Therefore, they have been corrupted and they are part of a system that is corrupting. And there's nothing that you or I can do about that, in my opinion. But that's okay because I don't know those people. Right? I'm told I'm supposed to care about them, but I don't believe the propaganda and I don't believe what I'm told. I don't think there's any logical reason why I should pretend that I can care about people that I don't know. It's a it's a double think or whatever. It's a gaslighting. So
There's the story of the Good Samaritan too, right?
yeah, but he meets that person. I'm not saying I ran a thrift store, so when they came in, I cared about them. I gave them clothes. That's different. I'm not saying I have to
Oh, but
know them.
you mean people that you haven't met,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
and I mean, also like the people I met in the thrift store, I don't care about them now because they're far away. So I'm not saying I should continue, but on the other hand, I made a connection to them. So there might still be something going on. So I'm certainly not saying this is just cognitive. Oh, I'll look out for my family, my friends, and nobody else. There's something energetic there. And I do think we're all energetically connected, but who's this all is that I don't know. I don't personally think I'm connected to 8 billion people out there because I don't think I could handle that. Like I used to do acting classes or improv, and it would take me an hour after there was only about 15 people of meditating to feel clear again. I felt so kind of gunky for all that. It's quite intimate acting improvisation. Um, so if you're open, and we need to be open if we're going to make any have any good effect, um, then yeah, we can't connect to that many people at all. Never mind at the same time. There's got to be just logical, right? Um, unless you're Christ, of course. But that's a whole other story. But what I was trying to get to here was that um, insofar as I mean, like the system can only work because people, again, like Matrix batteries are fueling it. People are making it work. So um, it's not that they're the enemy or anything, but if we're going to withdraw our consent, our energy, our complicity from the system because we know it's corrupting to the extent that we avoid being corrupted, then we also have to withdraw from the vast mass of humanity, I would say.
I'm almost worried to ask you a question because I know we're drawing towards the end of our time allotment, but I feel I should ask the question. To define our terms a little bit, when talking about the word the system, how do you define the system? What does that mean to you?
Well, first of all, what you were talking about, which is the world. So you're talking about different periods and different levels of corruption. So we've got history books that tell us that the world, quote unquote, the society that we live in today goes back a long time, and there's different mutations and variations, but basically, and obviously different continents and different cultures, but basically it's roughly the same. It's, small tribes that become larger communities, that become populations, that become nations, etc., right? And then the technology so we're seeing something that's fairly consistent developmentally, but also globally. So that's the first thing, is just society. But then at a deeper level, um, it has to do with, I suppose, it's like an internalized system that makes possible these larger communities and eventually ending as we are now with a global society, a global village. That's only possible if we internalize, you're talking about taboos, a certain system of values, which many of them seem superficially good. Certainly Christianity, things like love thy neighbor, but of course that's not, nobody's practicing that. But there's certain overlap with ideas that are practiced. The Old Testament is more closer to what we practice because we have legal systems and thou shalt not kill and so on. But for Girard, it would essentially be to do with mimetic desire and scapegoating, but we don't
Yeah,
have time.
behaviorism, mimicking. Yeah,
There's a lot, yeah. It can be very reductionist, and it can seem, well, we're just instinctive beings, but actually Girard's point is we're not. That's why mimetic desire is what makes us more than instinctive, because we can observe each other and imitate, and therefore we're coming outside the instinctive program where everything's unconscious. That's his point. But then when you start to imitate desire, then you start to be frustrated with your desire, and then violence erupts, and then you need a scapegoat to neutralize the violence. That's Girard in a
yeah,
nutshell. And so he's saying essentially that communities can't get bigger without scapegoating, and scapegoating means killing an innocent victim and then lying and saying that they were bad. So it's really bad. If you think that's the basis for all of civilization, it's a really bad basis. So although Girard isn't saying that civilization shouldn't exist, he is saying if we see the truth of it, then we don't have that much choice except to watch civilization unravel before our eyes. And then the only thing that can resolve that is the Christian ethic
yeah.
of love thy neighbor, resist not evil, where we won't scapegoat, we won't resort to violence. So that's so
So,
yeah. So the system
is
is
Rene Girard's theory of civilization and the one that you find is the most adequate to describe the truth of matters, or do you find that there are better or problems in how he was conceptualizing his story?
well, there's definitely problems. Of course, there's going to be problems with any model that it claims to explain everything. And Girard definitely had some major blind spots. So I'm not advocating Girard per se, but as a formula for understanding what the system is or explaining what I mean by it, I find it extremely helpful. If there's something that is a psychological mechanism, a psychological dynamic that we can test and observe and say, yeah, that does seem to be largely true, not just throughout literature and fiction and history itself, but in our own lives, like mimetic desire and rivalry and scapegoating, but that then can be telescoped out to explain not everything, but an awful lot that goes on. Then I find those are the most useful things because you have a very local model that you can test internally that does seem to uh,
Count for a lot of
it
empirical
can be
evidence.
got taken from micro to macro, and it's also like, oh, right, so that's what's going on. But my point is that it was in response to your question. So when I say the system, I mean not just history, society, the history of society, but um, what in the gospel, with Girard's interpretation, is Satan, is the Satan, this thing in us that wants to accuse and scapegoat the other, and that is constantly defended. Um, so that, yeah, so that's the system, and as long as people are possessed by that, metaphorically, if not literally, they're possessed by Satan. And so there's not much that Jesus can do. Like
So
each of us,
the system and Satan are very similar, is what you're saying, or like I,
yeah, they're kind of the same. Like if you want to read Girard as a anthropological psychological model, you can reduce Satan just to that. You can. I don't think he did, but as in a mechanism that is in all human beings, and that you can extrapolate from the literature, from Cain in the Book of Genesis, what happened with Cain and Abel, to other characters, and then in the Book of Genesis all the way to the Gospel and the way that Christ talks about Satan and the antidote, which being love thine enemies and resist not evil. Yeah, so it's a metaphysical principle that can also be observed psychologically. Whether, as you said earlier, there's an actual being there, who knows? Not who cares, but but why think about it too hard if you can't know that anyway? Yeah, and we'll find out maybe someday. But I don't think the approach changes, whether you look at it as an actual literal being or you look at it as some thing that's inside us, that's even part of biological evolution, but that screws us. Like as long as we are controlled, or as long as that's our prime directive, we're screwed.
So, oh God, I feel like we're opening up the door to a platonic dialogue because I want to ask you so many other questions. Let's do a little bit more, I guess. Okay, so following up on that, does he believe, or do you believe, this you, that there is any that it's 100% that all systems, which I guess involve uh, the thing that shapes it is the thing that shapes the standards that we are born into of whatever that is, like the laws, the broad narratives, the tempering of or the values that temper our identities and our passions. I guess that's how you're thinking about the system per se. Um, Sort of the accumulation of all of those things and a bit
Yeah,
more.
actually, yeah, I would say that's one way of looking at it. The accumulation of all of our thoughts, desires, and actions throughout
Okay.
history. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And that these are um, always 100% corrupt, or is it possible that it's a mixture of aspects that are corrupt and ill-intended, manipulative, satanic, as well as good-intended, just noble uh, things as well that are mixed up together, or do you think it's all bad? Is it all
No, well, no, I mean,
corrupt thing intrinsically?
I'd be pretty despairing if I thought that.
Okay.
Um, it might even be that goodness is as present. It, I mean, I'm stammering because I don't can't really believe this, but it could even be that good is as present in human beings, and therefore in human society as the opposite. But by the way, I mean, Girard's not saying this is evil. He's just saying it's the way things are. Um,
Yeah.
but within these terms. And I just wrote about this my last blog as well. That if you have a world built on certain values, then and these are the values that we're talking about here, then it only really recognize, much less rewards, things that ascribe to those values. So the point for Girard of Jesus's act, I mean his ministry and then his crucifixion, was that it was a demonstration to humankind, to those who witnessed it, and then those of us who got the gospel later, of what happens when something that is aligned with goodness moves into this world. Is it gets crushed, it gets destroyed because it has no power within this system by its nature. The only way it can assume power is by becoming like the system, so that it's recognized by it, and so that it has an equal kind of force to move within it. So Christ's example was of non-resistance. He simply went along with being crucified. He didn't even argue when he was being on trial, when he was on trial. So so that's why I say we're screwed, in terms of, and that's my response to think what you're asking, are all the systems more or less the same? Well, yes and no. I mean, clearly there are different degrees of tyranny and oppression and manifest malevolence. But if they're all based on the same principles and the same values and the same methods and the same internal mechanisms of scapegoating, and simply couldn't exist without those principles, then it's kind of a toss up, really, whether one society is better or worse. Because you could say the worse a society is, the more clearly you can see scapegoating is going on, the more you can say no to it. Whereas you have a relatively benign society where it's all going on behind closed doors, like satanic ritual abuse, you don't even realize. So, right, although I wouldn't wish on myself to be in a overtly totalitarian regime, although I kind of think we are at this point. I'm not in England, however. Um, I can see that there are benefits in that because you've got less and less choice. Well, you're getting more and more tested, I suppose. But I would say, I would hope, in my case, or yours, it would be less and less choice about being complicit. a certain point, you have to say, no, I will die rather than go along with this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's part of what I was, I guess, just thinking about. So, like, well, number one, I guess if all systems are a mixture of good and evil, is it always the same, constant, like the same proportion, the same ratios, or does it sometimes increase on the side of, like I
But
don't
I
take for
mean,
granted that I should have running water and electricity, and if I break my ribs, I've got a service that exists in my
you see,
moment
those, yeah,
here.
those are worldly criteria, so they're not going to
Yeah.
help you to figure that out. Because as we've seen, the more civilized the society becomes, often the more malevolent and destructive. But I was going to
When you say
answer
the
the,
more civilized, what do you mean? Like the
well, I
more
meant
with the greater
more
access to
advanced. Sorry, I meant the
material
more,
abundance, you mean?
yeah, the more advanced, so more technologically advanced. And anyway, we've only got a short curve that we can
Yeah, that's the
observe.
thing.
Right. But I was
Yeah.
gonna, because I know you don't want to go on too long, but I was gonna offer a fairly simple formula here, which is just a theory of mine, really, but it fits with Girard's, is that things essentially get, well, they get both better and worse, but in my lens, I'd say they get worse, although they're also getting closer to some sort of resolution, the larger a society becomes. Because if the scapegoating mechanism is the only way for a small community to become bigger without destroying itself, clearly the larger population we're talking about, the more these methods and these techniques and the satanic strategies are needed, I would say, to keep it together. So we are in this age, the global village, so-called overpopulation, in which the methods, the ruses, the strategies to keep us in line, to keep us from destroying each other and therefore society, which is, of course, the elite have their own interests in protecting themselves. They don't necessarily care what we do to each other, but they don't want us to destroy the infrastructures that they're using. Um, yeah, the larger it gets, the more problematic, the more corrupting, I would say, the society becomes because of this.
So do you
So,
think that if society would have these things, access to electricity and water and healthcare services removed from them, we'd be less corrupted and more pure?
well, no, we'd start killing each other, so it wouldn't be a good outcome either. It's just that this whole trajectory towards a globalist humanity, New World Order. Um, it's funny because conspiracy theorists they'll say globalism's bad, New World Order's bad, but the idea that we're all one humanity, that's good. But they're part of the same it's the same story. I was hoping actually I could bring this back to full circle because um, yes, a big part of the strategy, there is scapegoating, but it's become more and more subtle and it's happening online, on social media. People are scapegoating each other constantly. So there's a way that this scapegoating energy is being channeled and managed that keeps violence from erupting. And part of also what's going on is these creation of these post-Christian myths and stories that keep us enthralled and believing that we're moving somewhere um, meaningful and purposeful. So maybe this is a bit clumsy now, but I did think it would kind of possibly bring us full circle back to the UFO and these stories, but because they are also about collective humanity, um, right? But they're just stories, like this galactic empire, or yeah. I mean, one of the tropes about the alien thing is that it will unify humanity. We may see this unveil in our lifetimes. They've been
Yeah,
threatening.
holographic technology is pretty
Yeah,
pretty believable these days. I'm
yeah.
waiting for it.
Well, I am too kind of, but I mean, obviously, because it's predictable, maybe it won't happen. It's been predicted for decades now. But yeah, one of the main um, rationales given for why it was going to happen was because if you want a new world order, you need a scapegoat outside of the whole planet. So then you cue the alien invasion, right? that unifies humanity. But as we know, you and I, and those who researched it, unified humanity as the goal of the technocratic oligarchy, etc., it's not a benign thing. It's not a good outcome. We don't want to be unified in this brain link, Borg, mind, hive thing, right? It's not a good outcome. Well, I mean, we could be open-minded, I suppose. But for me, I'm not gonna take any nanotech or any implants, right? So that's an important thing to consider. Not that one wants to go in the opposite direction just because one doesn't like a given direction, but at least consider that maybe insofar as a global, technologically linked humanity is the plan of the elite, and therefore we don't want any part of it. Maybe the right trajectory is the opposite, which is, I mean, politically, balkanization, but I'm not political. But just
There's
going
political
back,
effects. There's
back,
going to be political consequences to the
well,
ideal, the
they're
abstract concept
happening.
you're throwing out.
Yeah, if I was influencing anyone at that level, but I'm not. But
Ideas travel in a weird way, dude. I don't know. I'm just saying, like they're
okay, but
nonlinear.
what I'm saying, there would be consequences, but not this kind. But uh, a movement towards or back to just local community, whereby we get to see the problems of humanity, quote unquote, up close and deal with them. I mean, clearly that's a good learning curve to be on at the
Sure.
very least, right? But at best, we are actually finding a way to live that did work better. I mean, this is my answer to the question. Things just get worse and worse because we get more and more connected in these illegitimate ways by technology and under the rubric of the elite, of the controlling factions, and there's more and more of us, that's the crisis to me. I don't see an environmental crisis or even necessary crisis of resources, but just something to do with human consciousness is getting more and more
Yeah.
bowdlerized and distorted
Mm,
by this false imposition or this crushing together of
mhm.
all of humanity into this one thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. I could agree with that. So, um, actually, before last question, agape as a concept, what does it mean to you? Do you believe it's just an illusion, or how do you think about agape?
Well, you just mentioned it in the context of Crowley, so I'm wondering why you're asking me now, because it's not in the Prison of Infinity. Is
No, I
it
know
just
it was a side note because it's in the Bible about the idea of agapic love in the writings of Saint Paul. So I was curious about the concept as it occurs in Saint Paul's writings to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand Eros and Agape, this physical love.
Not the Crowley perversion of the thing. I'm talking about the
I
thing,
know,
like the
I
idea
don't even
itself.
know what
Yeah.
that is really, but yeah, so spiritual love. I suppose it would be unconditional love, Agape, would it? Do you think be synonymous with, or at least include the idea of unconditional love?
I don't know if it's unconditional in the sense of yeah, maybe. I mean,
I
I
mean,
do think of it as like of a higher order of love that touches upon something
yeah,
a bit more
I wonder if we're so debased by this system, uh, and its supposed perks like Hallmark cards and the Beatles that the word love doesn't fit, if you know what I mean. Like we have an idea of love that it's an emotion and it's good feeling and all that. So to me, agape means love as comic book reference here now, but the Silver Surfer said was the power supreme. And here's this guy who's flying around the cosmos on his surfboard, and he can't. The one place he can't get back to is the planet he left his beloved on, because there's a force field that prevents him. So he's the loneliest bodhisattva in the universe, and so he is yearning in a romantic sense, but he's also talking about, as a cosmic being, that love is the power supreme because love is a synonymous or another word for, or a more human word for the force of creation, which is true at a profane level. Although that would be eros, ironically, wouldn't it? But anyway, it might be a false dichotomy between eros and agape. But in that sense, absolutely, I think that is the ruling principle of existence, and how could it be any other? But practically speaking, agape, it does sound like love thine enemies as thyself, so that would be consistent with the gospel. Paul's talking about it. And practically speaking, I see it as there's probably a word for this, but I don't know what the word would be. But it's like a necessary hypothesis that is inseparable from its unattainability. Like we need the idea that it is possible somehow to love thine enemies as thyself, just to move at least in that direction. And knowing that it's impossible, really, at a human level, shouldn't discourage us. So that's kind of my view about agape. It's something by definition that transcends our human limitations, but maybe there's something in us that transcends human limitations. Right? So
Yeah.
maybe
Okay.
it
I
is
mean,
work.
I hear you. That's okay. I definitely don't think it's possible to like your enemies as yourself, but to love is, I guess, it's a more challenging idea philosophically than simply to like. And
Well, yeah, because what would it look like?
yeah,
Exactly. You wouldn't be inviting them around for tea, and you probably wouldn't be telling them what wonderful people they are because they're not, right? So, but it has to do with not wanting to scapegoat them, not turning them
yeah,
into reason
yeah,
for
to
you.
like have a relationship to your enemy, so called, as without invoking a feeling of a desire for revenge to destroy them an eye for an eye or something. Those feelings that are so easy to tap into to try to not fall into that trap. But that's difficult. Like, what comparative do you have to sort of see the shattered child, the pathetic thing inside of the person that's doing such evil that is maybe not hate worthy, but pity worthy. Um, that
Yeah.
might be something, the quality of emotion that is required to feel that might involve the agapic idea. I just find it a very challenging idea. So I just want to get your thoughts on that, chime in before we end. So without further ado, uh, Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering, and the Psychology of Fragmentation by Jasun Horsley. Highly, highly recommended. The link to this book and Jason's other works will be in the description box under this video. So check that out. And Jason, thank you for taking the 2 hours, and I look forward to future chats with you.
Well, thanks, Matthew. It was fun as always, and we went into some deep, not that unexpected areas as always. So yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right. Take care, man. Bye.
Bye.